Hello, I'm Night Novel, your humble storyteller for this evening. Welcome back to 𝐏𝐴 𝐥𝐚𝐥𝐞, where things are dire indeed. Esther, in a fugue state, ran far, far away from the manor after witnessing what might have been Isaiah's last moments, and now, if we don't get back by nightfall, which I doubt we'll be able to do without the key, we'll enter a catatonic state and perish here in the forest. Because our medicine is still at the manor. When Esther began to walk again, her steps grew much more hurried. Nothing looked familiar, and yet somehow she still wondered if she hadn't seen it all before. She thought she remembered finding the manor in the east, in the opposite direction of the setting sun, but in the back of her mind, she was starting to doubt if her own memory could truly be trusted any longer. Once more, Esther found herself completely lost in these vast, lonely woods. This time, she didn't even have her meager supplies with her, nor the comfort of knowing she could survive the night. In a way, she felt like she was trapped in a loop, reliving a twisted, more fateful version of her earlier journey. Afraid of finding the manor, even more terrified of not finding it, doing her best to believe that everything would be all right. Oh, a stream. As evening steadily crept closer, Esther encountered a little stream running along her path. At first, her heart leapt, but then a flash of fear overtook her brief hope. Was it really the same stream she'd played in with 𝐏𝐚𝐥𝐞? Or could it be a different one altogether? She didn't remember anything familiar about this spot. Maybe if she followed it along, she'd encounter something else. The stream had flowed to the right of where they stood on its bank. Or had it? With a sense of growing, empty dread slowly building in her chest, Esther realized just how shapeless her memories and thoughts had become. Perhaps that was why everything seemed the same, and yet completely different, with no solid reality she could tether herself to. And at any moment, a dream could become a nightmare. Oh, don't say that. I swear if you play ominous music now, I turn off all the lights in my room and now I regret it. Okay, if you're listening to this still, like 11 episodes in, firstly, hey, thank you. Secondly, get a blanket, 'cause it's about to get spooky. Night had fallen. It arrived far, far too quickly, cloaking the forest in a thick darkness that made it even more deeply confusing. She'd been running for a while now. Her eyes started around, trying to desperately glean any memories or points of interest that stirred her mind. But nothing ever appeared. The stillness that surrounded her suddenly felt eerie beyond compare. She could hear the rustling of leaves, the crickets, the nocturnal creatures that skittered after prey or fled from predators. But she never saw them. Nothing moved. Everything looked the same, like a painting, an image frozen in time, never changing. As if she kept going down the same path over and over again. And there's the music. She's reacting to it too. As Esther dashed into another cluster of dark trees. A horrible, petrifying realization flashed before her. Isaiah's key. She had given it to 𝐏𝐚𝐥𝐞. The warding charm that protected the manor, that meant... No. No. Please, no. She wouldn't be able to go back. There was nothing. She had nothing of Isaiah's, no way to regain entry after leaving the protected space. How far did the ward's perimeter even reach? Was she only a few minutes away from the manor, or miles? It didn't matter. She had no hope of reaching the road, even if she'd known where it was. No way of returning to the manor, except if she encountered 𝐏𝐴𝐚𝐴. But Esther had gone all day. Surely 𝐏𝐴𝐚𝐴 would have noticed her disappearance by now. If she'd been searching for Esther, they would have encountered each other after so many hours. Esther hadn't even strayed that far. Had she? No, she hadn't. She'd turned around and gone back the way she came. But what if she'd been running back towards the manor when she awoke? Desperately, frantically trying to get back, trying to find a way back in. And all this time, she'd only been walking in hopeless circles, never getting closer or further away. Only the trees shifting while she remained in place. As she tried to curl her arms around herself for warmth, they seemed heavier than before, like they were being steadily filled with lead. Her flesh was still sensitive, but her muscles no longer responded like they usually did. A feeling as if she was trying to move a puppet with fraying strings. It was past the time for her dose. She broke into a sprint. Each step grew more impossible than the last, and her body threatened to collapse from the strain at any moment. It was as horrifying as the doctor's warnings. No, worse, for nothing could describe the sense of all control slipping away. Stumbling forward, she barely managed to catch her balance. Please say we're going to meet 𝐏𝐴𝐚𝐴. Holding onto a tree for support as her legs seemed on the verge of giving away. No, I won't let it. Her fingernails dug desperately into the crumpling bark. She couldn't let go. If she did, there'd be no getting back up again. She had to keep going. She had to keep looking. To fail like this. A loud thought occurred to her. It blared through her ears, growing, deafening her, drowning out everything else. Oh no. Who was she really holding on for? At last, her body could no longer support itself. She collapsed to the ground, whimpering, trying to push herself up again. But after one last, desperate strain of her arms and legs, she fell still. Even her eyes refused to move. Her gaze remained frozen, staring in terror up at the sky, no longer able to see what was going on around her. Panic flooded her entire system, making the world spin and turning her thoughts into fragments of fear. Suddenly, she understood. She would die like Isaiah, alone, frozen in horror, feeling the cold grip of death squeezing her lungs. Rotting while still breathing, forced to remain conscious as every faculty in her body broke down, praying for it all to end. No. This is not how it ends. I know it's a dark Please, end. Please, make it stop. Please. 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 A distant cry echoed through her head. Something far away in the dark, shifting among those unmoving trees. Come on, 𝐏𝐚𝐥𝐞. Maybe it was coming for her. Maybe it had been waiting for her to fall helpless. Again, the sound cried out. Closer this time. It was familiar somehow. Like a dream. Like awakening from a dream. Oh, that better be 𝐏𝐚𝐥𝐞, carrying a silver pocket watch. Esther? 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 Esther, please. That voice. It belonged to 𝐏𝐚𝐥𝐞. She could hear her footsteps in the distance, running, getting neither closer nor farther away. If only she could call out to her. But she couldn't. She was completely, totally helpless. 𝐏𝐚𝐥𝐞 would pass her by and forever believe that Esther had abandoned her. Had Isaiah endured this too? Had he heard his daughter calling for him, running past just out of sight? Unable to cry, unable to scream, unable to reach out for help, unable to do anything but wait. Esther! Esther, are you out there? She was so close. Soon, she would pass by. Esther? Esther, please, please answer me. But instead of fading into the distance, the voice grew even closer. Closer, 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 until... Esther? Oh no. A figure crashed to the ground beside her. Warm hands grasped her shoulders, then frantically pressed over her heart. Oh, Esther, you're still breathing. I'm so glad. I'm so glad too. Oh no. You can't move. Oh no. Your medicine. You don't have it. But there's no time. I can't risk running back for the watch. She heard 𝐏𝐚𝐥𝐞 inhale a trembling breath, desperately trying to calm herself. Then, thin, wiry arms began to cradle her body, lifting her slowly upward. I can do it. I can. At first, 𝐏𝐚𝐥𝐞 staggered to her feet, as if her small figure couldn't handle Esther's weight. But then, as soon as she caught her balance, stumbling forward a few steps, she slowly began to run. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about, 𝐏𝐚𝐥𝐞. You go, girl. Yes, yes. Oh my gosh. I'll bring you back. Hold on, Esther.
I promise you'll be all right.
Her head rested against Sana's shoulder. It felt so warm, so comforting. Sana had come to save her. That was the only thing Esther could bring herself to care about. Whether or not they made it back to the manor in time, it didn't really matter anymore. The smaller girl gasped and panted with effort, but her pace never slowed. Her footsteps raced through the forest, so strong and so determined, never straying from their goal. She saw things Esther couldn't see, the hidden paths, the different trees, the stars that mapped the true direction. And for her, Isaiah's words relented. There were no circles, only a straight and unwavering line. Through the final trees, towards the clearing, into the mists that had once warned her away. Into the manor she had tried to escape from.
Finally.
After dashing up the stairs with Esther still in her arms, Sana ran into the bedroom. As soon as she'd set the taller girl onto the bedsheets, she grabbed Esther's watch from the nightstand, frantically grasping for its switch.
Here. Your arm. The medicine.
She pushed up Esther's sleeve, though her hands were shaking so much that she could barely hold the watch. With a deep breath, Sana steadied herself and pushed the needle into Esther's arm. The usual moment of relief never arrived, only the sudden wave of nausea. But slowly, steadily, a trace of energy began returning to her muscles. She squeezed her eyes shut and reopened them, blinking to try and relieve the raw, burning sensation. Death had graced her so closely that she could feel it, an icy cloud still hovering across her skin.
Esther? Is it working? Esther, please. Yes.
Forcing out the word in a choked, hoarse voice, she tried to offer Sana a faint smile.
Thank you. Esther. You're all right. You're all right.
The tears that she'd been barely holding back suddenly began overflowing. Sobbing, Sana threw her arms around Esther, burying her face against the other girl's neck. As more of her strength gradually returned, she was able to drape her own arms around Sana. The intense shock made it difficult, if not impossible, for her to truly form any thoughts. All she could feel was an immense, overwhelming relief, a deep gratitude for every breath she took. Oh, that had me so on edge. Often we expect stories to end well, right, and go well. We don't expect our protagonist to die in the woods. But I don't trust this story at all. And I have no idea how much is left.
I'm so sorry. So sorry. I don't want you to go. I never wanted you to go.
Sana's tearful whimpers were soft and muffled. Esther could feel warm tears falling against her shoulder, and the trembling exhales that followed each sob.
I was just so sad thinking of Papa. But I don't want you to leave, Esther. Please don't. Please don't leave me. I won't. I promise I won't.
Murmuring gently, she gave a tight squeeze of her arms around 𝐏𝐚𝐜.
There's still so much we have to do together, isn't there? Games, picnics, recipes, reading, exploring. I couldn't leave you before all that.
She embraced her, wiped her tears, and hushed her gently, cradling her smaller friend against her chest. But nothing she said or did seemed to comfort 𝐏𝐚𝐜. Her whole body kept shaking like a leaf, suddenly fragile and on the cusp of breaking. Esther was almost afraid to touch her. Still, she gingerly stroked her fingers through that soft blonde hair, holding her as she let out everything that had built up inside. Not just from that night, but ever since her father disappeared. No one had held her. No one had comforted her. No one had told her that everything would be all right, no matter how much it hurt at that moment. Esther desperately wished she could do more, that she could travel back in time to be there for 𝐏𝐚𝐜 when nobody else was. At the very least, she could be here now. She could promise not to hurt her friend ever again. Pinky promise. At last, 𝐏𝐚𝐜's trembling sobs and uneven breathing began to subside. From the way her chest rhythmically rose and fell, and her body limply rested against Esther's, she knew 𝐏𝐚𝐜 had fallen asleep. Running all the way home while carrying Esther must have left her exhausted. If not for her surge of fear and determination, there was no way she would have been able to lift a girl Esther's size for so long. And yet, somehow, 𝐏𝐚𝐜 had still managed to save her. A crushing sense of guilt sank down in her stomach. If only she'd been more careful with her medicine, if she hadn't let herself get so distraught and irrational, she never would have caused 𝐏𝐚𝐜 this kind of pain and worry. Esther had forced her to relive the night Isaiah disappeared, struck by the same fear and despair of being abandoned. And she too had been so close to meeting Isaiah's same fate, if 𝐏𝐚𝐜 hadn't found her at the last moment. Swallowing hard to hold back her tears, Esther gently detached from 𝐏𝐚𝐜 to pull herself up. She was too exhausted to change into her night clothes, but at least she could put both of them under the covers. Pulling the fluffy comforter up to the smaller girl's shoulders, she tucked her in tightly, which seemed to lessen 𝐏𝐚𝐜's trembling somewhat. In a way, she almost felt too guilty to hold her again. After hurting her so badly, did she really deserve to comfort 𝐏𝐚𝐜, to share her presence? No, 𝐏𝐚𝐜 wanted her there. She still had to remind herself of that, even after everything that had happened. Guilt, doubt, shame, none of it mattered anymore. 𝐏𝐚𝐜 had already made it clear how much she cared about Esther, and doubting her would be the same as rejecting her. Oh, that's so true. Esther, you gotta treat yourself like you would treat your best friend, okay? You gotta treat yourself like you would treat 𝐏𝐚𝐜. Back in the forest, lying there in the darkness, she had given into her fear of abandonment. But that was a mistake she refused to ever repeat. From now on, no matter what happened, she would trust 𝐏𝐚𝐜, her kind, dear, selfless companion. She would never let her down again. and somehow she'd find a way to repay her. Good night, 𝐴𝐚. Sweet dreams. Whispering softly, she pressed a small kiss against the top of 𝐴𝐚's head. In response, the other girl made a soft sound in between a whimper and a sigh, curling up to Esther's side. When she closed her eyes, Esther felt a powerful exhaustion sweep over her, greater than perhaps any night before. Endless thoughts kept circling in her head, dreadful memories and ghosts of the fears she'd had while paralyzed, facing her death. But the warm presence nestled up against her, fragile and vulnerable, and yet so strong and incredibly willful, soothed Esther's frayed nerves. Before long, she was slipping into a deep and dreamless sleep, completely removed from all the cares in the world. Yet still holding on to her dearest companion, who held her tightly in return. And now the question is, do we get another vision? Stray leaves floated down the stream, slowly disappearing into darkness. He watched them pass by with a certain, strange melancholy. The idea of leaving behind his research, those countless hours of experiments and writing, no longer bothered him. But moments like these, now that he was faced with losing them forever, the simplest pleasures of life suddenly seemed invaluable. Every morning in the garden, every thunderstorm on a spring day, every cup of tea and conversation at the table, every night clear enough to admire the constellations. He wished he'd appreciated them more. Up until now, he hadn't realized how much they meant to him, how many little joys he had never bothered savoring. If only he could have recognized it all earlier. So many things never show their value until they were gone. Oh. So, are we standing? Are we sitting? Are we lying? Are we... His thin, trembling fingers brushed across the top of 𝐴𝐚's head. She was fast asleep, lying contentedly in his lap. He'd given her an astronomical lecture that night, but despite her best efforts to stay awake, she had finally dozed off halfway through. Oh, so that the lecture was in astronomy, or was it just like huge, astronomical? But what? You certainly worked hard today, didn't you? I suppose you did inherit my ways after all. He murmured affectionately, unable to contain a smile, painful as it was. This was the last time they'd ever spent time together. He'd realized it earlier, but he forced himself to act as normal and unaffected as possible during their walk, despite the anguish he felt whenever he remembered. How quickly all these years had gone by. He'd never imagined it would end like this. I need some answers. Since his escape from the mausoleum that fateful night, dark, irrational feelings had begun creeping into the edges of his mind, growing stronger day by day. Fear and resentment with little substance behind them. distorted images of both himself and 𝐏𝐚𝐜, twisting them both into reprehensible monsters. It was the same bitterness he'd felt so long ago, back when they'd first moved here together. 𝐏𝐚𝐜 became the personification of all this misfortune and woe, a symbol of life's mockery, instead of his beloved, irreplaceable daughter. He slipped into such thoughts without realizing it, and only in the middle of that bleak, hateful fog would he suddenly come to himself again. Suffocated by his growing paranoia and anxiety, his lucid moments were steadily withering away. Now he had to shut himself in his study most of the day, never knowing when a wave of delusions would seize him. No longer could he freely spend his days working with 𝐏𝐚𝐜, for he constantly feared what those venomous shadows would make him say to her. Their whispers had become so frequent that soon he knew they would overtake his mind completely. But tonight, summoning the last of his strength, he had offered to take her on a walk by the stream, determined to spend one last quiet evening together. How overjoyed she had been. She believed he was finally getting better again, and soon life would return to how it once was. Was it crueler to lie to her, or to tell her that he was dying? He kept agonizing over the decision, which seemed to have no right answer. "I'll tell her tomorrow," he always thought. But whenever a new morning arrived, and she was so thrilled to see him outside of his room again, his will kept faltering. I mean, in the face of 𝐏𝐚𝐜, I can understand why. He wished he could have seen her grow up. She already resembled her mother so much. No doubt she'd be her spitting image as an adult. In the clear part of his mind, he no longer felt bitterly towards Amaranth. Even if she rejected the life of a mother, and even if her disappearance had led him to such despair, she had still given him 𝐏𝐚𝐜. Somehow, somewhere, he hoped she could find happiness. She deserved a life better than whatever he could have offered. Just like 𝐏𝐚𝐜 did. Moving slowly to avoid disturbing her, Isaiah rose to his feet, holding 𝐏𝐚𝐜 closely against his chest. In a way, he was relieved she had fallen asleep. He didn't think he could bear bidding goodnight to her, knowing it would be the final time. But goodbyes were for the benefit of the living, not the dead. The memory would soon be hers, and only hers. Even knowing that, he still couldn't bring himself to disturb her peaceful rest. Perhaps she would forgive him this one last selfish act. Turning towards the manor, he began the journey home with slow, lingering steps. He could sense a storm gradually approaching. Heavy rain was on its way, the type that would blanket the manor for a long, gloomy day. But once the storm lifted, the fragile blooms of spring would flourish in its wake. Over and over again, year after year. No matter what befell them, they would always come back. They will. Room service. Ah! A soft clatter, followed by an even softer gasp, stirred Esther from the edge of sleep. Oh, she just broke us out of an important vision. To be continued, I suppose. With that, we close the page on this evening's story. But of course, there is still more left to tell. So stay safe, take care of yourself, and please, return here whenever you wish. This is Night Novel, signing off.